that's the best. This is it. This is the best thing.
All right, well, I'll get started. I'll kick it off here. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our October Coffee and Conversations series presented jointly by the Carsey School of Public Policy, the New Hampshire Bureau of Education and Training, and the New Hampshire Certified Public Managers Association. We're so thrilled to have Dr. Andy Smith, Director of the UNH Survey Center here. I'm going to just give you a brief background about Andy, and then we'll get this thing started. So Dr. Andrew Smith, as I mentioned, he's the Director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center. He has more than 20 years experience in academic survey research, currently as the Director of the Survey Center since 1999, following positions at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the University of Cincinnati. He received his PhD from the University of Cincinnati, and his dissertation is entitled Survey Questions and American Public Opinion. As director, Dr. Smith is responsible for overall staff and financial management of the UNH Survey Center. Dr. Smith is also an associate professor of practice in political science in the UNH Department of Political Science, where his teaching and research is focused on survey methodology, elections, and public policy. Dr. Smith has been a member of the American Association for Public Opinion Research since 1987 and is a member of its New England chapter. He is also a founding member of the Association of Academic Survey Research Organizations. His methodological research has included work on question wording effects, question and response order effects, the issue of non-attitudes in surveys, and methods of improving the accuracy of pre-election surveys. He regularly presents at academic conferences on public opinion and political science, and we are thrilled to have him here today to present on polling and the 2020 New Hampshire primary.
Good morning. So you came out bright and early to hear a nice boring talk about survey research methods. So if you remember back to your statistics classes in college, you're probably panicking about now. Well, I'm not going to get into statistics because I think most of what we have to deal with in survey research isn't statistically based. It's up in people's heads, which is a different issue. But what I want to do today is talk a bit about polling in the New Hampshire primary, kind of where we are, a little bit of history, go into some of the specifics, and really look at it with a jaundiced eye, because I think too much, especially this year, we're depending on, the media in particular, depend too much on polling at the expense of other aspects of campaigns. And I want to emphasize some of the problems that we have with polling and maybe make you a little bit more suspicious consumers of polling when you're looking at this stuff. So first off, everybody remembers back in 2016, polls in 2016 were wrong, right? Well, actually they weren't, but it becomes part of the political narrative. Polling now is so much part of the narrative and there are so many polls now that it's difficult for the public to figure out what is a good poll and what's a bad poll. In part, we like to believe the stuff that shows our guy winning, and if it doesn't show our guy winning, it must have some serious methodological flaws to those polls. That's the environment we're in now, and like cartoons, poll 4 and 5 don't trust Washington, and the survey says 9 and 10 don't trust polls. Yeah, they're probably both right. The problem that we get is that now the belief in polling and how polls relate to things are tied to, they've gotten tied to our perceptions of the media in general and how they cover politics. So polls, goes back to the 2016 general election. We're talking about bias, and you can see this. Polls are generally accurate. If it's Clinton, and remember Clinton was winning most of the polls, and the Trump people are all thinking now that polls obviously are wrong. This is, and nobody thinks they were biased in favor of Trump. But this is the perception that's out there. And it does roll into how we perceive the media. So what I want to do talk about first is just a very short history of election polling, very short. So first off, they're old, almost as old as the country. The very first poll occurred, what's called straw polls back then, in 1824. This is the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and it did a poll showing that Andrew Jackson would win in the areas around Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Why did they have it in their newspaper back in 1824? It was of interest to their readers. People like to read about this stuff. They wanted to have an idea who was going to win. So it's an old thing, and during the later part of the 1800s into the 1900s, newspapers across the country conducted what they called straw polls. In the 1896 election, there were 6 different organizations that conducted national straw polls. And by going through the 1920s and into the 1930s, there were many newspapers that did it, certainly locally within their state or within their city, but nationally as well. There was a magazine called the Literary Digest that during that period became very well known for its final election poll in the October issue before the election. The Literary Digest at that time was the largest selling magazine in the entire country by far. It was bigger than, say, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News for people my age rolled together. And it did this poll for years. It hadn't been particularly accurate, but it had been predicted in the winter, and it was the only one that was really doing it at this sort of a scale. It was waited for a lot. So in 1936, they came up, they did their poll, and the Literary Digest said that 43% of the public was going to vote for Franklin Roosevelt, 57% for Alf Landon. And the thing about this poll, they sent out ballots. This was back before telephone days. They sent out ballots to over 8 million people, got about 2.1 million votes back, counted it up, and this is what they got. So if you were to calculate a margin of sampling error on this, which I should say you can't because of the requirements of the model, but if you were, the sampling error would be about 0.0001%. So you would think this is really accurate. But how did they get it so wrong? And then Gallup at the time got it right. Well, they got it wrong because of their sampling frame. Sampling frame is essentially the list where you draw your potential respondents from. They used motor vehicle registration lists and telephone directories. And they drew people from those lists and sent out ballots to them. But what's going on in 1936? The middle of the Depression. Who's most likely to have a car and or a telephone back then? Somebody with money. Which at that time, in the 1930s, that was much more likely to be a Republican. So they went out and interviewed a bunch of Republicans and asked those Republicans who they were going to vote for. The Republicans said, Alf Landon. Didn't work so much. Well, at the same time, George Gallup and a couple other researchers were developing what they called scientific polling, and Gallup was a bit of a salesman, or I guess a lot of a salesman. He went to newspapers and said, 2 things. First off, that he guaranteed that his polling would be more accurate than the Literary Digest poll. They could have their money back if it wasn't. The second thing he guaranteed then was that their subscription rates or the number of copies they sold would go up when they published the Gallup poll. He was right on both cases. So what they did, you can see was more accurate, not what we would consider particularly accurate today. 5 percentage points off in his estimate for Roosevelt, but certainly more accurate than the Literary Digest. And as a matter of course, the Literary Digest was bankrupt the next year, not necessarily because of this, it wasn't a depression, but they went out of business. So these are the 3 guys that founded what we think of as modern polling. This is Archibald Crossley, Elmo Roper, and George Gallup. These were the guys that came out of really market research and psychology and developed what we think of as modern polling. But the polling that they did, the sampling that they used was what we call cluster sampling, meaning that quota sampling. They would say, we need a certain percentage of men, a certain percentage of women, older people, younger people, wealthier people, lower income people, urban, rural, and they would fill their quotas and try to make that of a more representative sample. But it wasn't random based. They would basically say, I need this many people that look like this, and their interviewers would go out and find them and talk with them. Well, you come up to the 1948 election, Dewey defeats Truman election. This was the end of quota sampling. There was a big investigation afterwards. By this time, the survey research business has become a fairly big business, both in the business world for consumer products, but also in the political world. And this was a big blotch on the survey research business. We had to investigate what happened, figure out why the polls were wrong. Well, a couple things I found out. First was that the polls that were conducted were still done in person. They were largely completed by early October, because it took a long time to get them mailed back, to get them entered into the rudimentary computers of the day, analyzed, reported, and put out. So they were completed about a month before the election. And now with hindsight and survey research, we figure out there's a good chunk of the electorate, about half the electorate, that really isn't paying much attention to the presidential race a month out. So conducted polls closer. The second thing they did was they realized that quota sampling wasn't good. They were using quotas that were based on pre-war estimates of where people were and so forth. And they moved to the idea of random sampling after this. Because if you randomly sample people from a list of all of the potential voters or people who live in your state or your country, well, then you can use the central limit theorem, which allows you to do those sorts of calculations of margins of sampling error and all that sort of stuff that we see today. And it has been proven to be a much more accurate way of getting a representative sample. Then in the 1960s and 70s, we moved from this, the elections were held today, which are the following excuses you give for not voting, in-person polling, to telephone polling. I'm undecided, but that doesn't mean I'm apathetic or uninformed. We moved to this. Why do you think we moved from in-person polling to telephone polling? Cheaper. Cheaper. Order of magnitude cheaper. So to conduct it back then, to conduct a national in-person survey would be in the $50,000 to $75,000. To do a telephone poll would be in the $500 to $7,500 range, $5,000 to $7,500 range. That's now it's gone way up from that, but orders of magnitude difference. We're in the midst of a similar sort of thing right now. We're in a paradigm shift between other previous ways of doing survey research and how we can do it more accurately in the future. And some of the things that we've known to be true in the survey research world, like starting with probability-based, random-based samples, are going away. And they're going away largely because of the cost. So what we're seeing now is a big increase of web polls. This blue line, these are national election polls. But you can see that we've seen this big spike in online polls. We've seen a decline in polls with live interviewers. IVR stands for the interactive voice response. Those are the robo polls, where you don't have an interviewer, you just have a computer saying either press 1 for yes, press 2 for no, or say who you're going to vote for. Well, you're seeing those things decline because it's much, much more expensive. As an example, in the work that we do over the last 5 years, it used to be that we could get about 1 completed interview on our typical poll in an hour. So if an interviewer worked on the telephones for an hour, they could complete about 1 interview. That's down to about 0.35 interviews per hour now. It means our costs have tripled in the last 5 years. So now to conduct a statewide survey in New Hampshire, it's about $50,000 to do it. It was $15,000 to $20,000 5 years ago. So if you are a media organization, where are you going to go? You don't have the money to do this anymore. So what you do is you go to the less expensive ones. And what when I was doing this research that looked at this, we talked about, first our title was Gresham's Law in the era of 538. 538 refers to the 538 website that does the whole poll aggregation. How many of you know what Gresham's Law is? This is an old economics rule. There you go.
The bad money drives out the good.
Right. It comes from the idea of back in the days when you had coins that had real valuable metal in it. If the king wanted to have a little bit more money, he would issue currency that had less gold in it or less silver in it. But the public would figure that out. So what they would do is they would take their 95, 100% gold coins and stick them in their pocket and spend the ones with less gold value in it. So it drove the good stuff out of the market. I think that's what's going on in the polling world, where because we're in this era of 538, which means if you look at that 538 website, they combine and aggregate all sorts of polls in there, regardless of methodology. And if you've got cheaper ones, they now make the bulk of what we see in these polling aggregation sites, especially in state level polls. So in the 2016 election, I was looking at the state of North Carolina, which was a battleground state. This is one that everybody was really paying attention to. The 4 polls that made up the polling averages on these websites included 2 IVR polls, robo-polls, and 2 web-based polls. One of the IVR polls was conducted by a market research firm that was affiliated with one of the political parties. There was nothing in there that any pollster, anybody in survey research would consider a gold standard sort of survey. But that became the average, and that became what fed into those models that said that Clinton had an 80% or a 90% chance of winning. Bad data. But it doesn't matter, because what does the press do with this? They publish the next number. And they have some back reason for this. Busy table, look for the little red lines there. This is some research that we did going back to 2006, looking at every statewide poll in battleground states where there was actually a competitive election, and looking at how the final polls worked out. President, governor, Senate races, live phone interviewers, IVR, that's the robocalls, and then online polls. The red ones are the ones that were most accurate in that particular type of election in that particular year. Do you see any pattern? Not really. Not really. So you could be running a crummy online poll and say, hey, we're just as accurate as you guys are. So why not use us? You can do an online poll for $2,500, $5,000. Do a telephone poll, an IVR, you can do an IVR poll for $10,000. It's going to cost you $50,000 to do a live interviewer poll. They're all about the same in their accuracy. Why not? Problem is, with these online polls, they don't start with random samples. There's no such thing as a way to randomly select email addresses. So it's a convenience sample. It's like bumping into people on the street. And now what we've got as an industry, I say as an industry meaning both the academic end of survey research, but also the government and business end of survey research, is now we've gotten to the point where the big organizations have decided that probability-based samples, it'd be nice if we could have them, but these non-probability samples work pretty good too. And they're now rationalizing why we should use non-probability samples. The main reason is it's cheaper, but now we've got this rationalization process to explain why we can throw out 50 to 60 years worth of tradition and behavior and go back to essentially convenience samples. So it becomes a problem, and the problem is for consumers is, who do you trust? What I would say is there are one organization, it's called American Association of Public Opinion Research. They've got a nice section on political polling, worth reading, to look at the things that you should look at with political polls, including who's paying for it, when it was done, how the sample was constructed, how the data were collected, what kind of weighting was done, and so forth. Problem is, a lot of those organizations that are doing polls don't make that information readily available. The Transparency Initiative, which APOR has gone through, it's not like a seal of approval for the poll, but it means it's a seal of approval that you're willing to put out all of the methods and how you conduct the poll. So look for organizations that have gone through the APOR Transparency Initiative, because at least they're willing to say, this is all the stuff that we've done. All right, so that's enough on histories of polling. Why do we do election polling in the first place? Well, if you're in a campaign, you're judging the effectiveness of your message, resonating with people, is it working that way? Second is academics do this because we're looking at how people pay attention when they get engaged in elections, what are the issues that seem to be moving people. It's certainly content for TV shows. And it's content because it sells advertising. It sells advertising. Same thing that George Gallup said in 1936 is absolutely true today. When television organizations went into the polling business in the 1970s, they did it because more people watched the TV shows, the news shows, when they had polls on them than otherwise. And now in the days where we've got the internet, everybody's got a website, Guess what people click on? So this is why so many polls, eyeballs plus clicks equals money. And if you're in a, I know we have a member of the media here today, the organizations are on your website. If you have a poll listed, people click on it. And if they click on it, you make more money. That's the revenue stream. So that's the big reason you're seeing this proliferation of polls, but low-cost polls, because it doesn't really matter what poll you put up there, people will click on it. And the headlines that get written because of that are really kind of scary, because we'll have, I was looking today, Elizabeth Warren, the new front runner. And I looked at the analysis that this guy was saying, well, Elizabeth Warren is at 26.5% and Joe Biden is at 26%. That's a tie. Elizabeth Warren really hasn't led in a national poll or a state poll, with maybe one outlier, anywhere in the country over the last couple months, even though now Elizabeth Warren is the front runner, right? Yeah. She's up by 2 percentage points here, 3 percentage points there. It's all in the margin of sampling error. It's noise. And it's noise at the time when nobody's really paying that much attention to the election. So the reason that that is listed that way, though, is people will click on a headline that says, there's a new front runner, who's in the lead. Same reason you go to a baseball game, you want to know what the score is. How many people are really interested in the difference between some guy's slider and his slurve or his curveball? Yeah, there's a few people are, but most people just want to see who's winning and who's losing. All right. Now let's get into the process. It's important to remember about the nomination process, kind of where we are when you think about polling in the primaries. First, in the invisible primary, there's only 4 ways of measuring how good a candidate is. And what we mean by the invisible primary is everything that happens before somebody casts a vote. So everything that happens before the Iowa caucus. And the way you measure this is endorsements, especially national figures or governors, senators, and so forth. Money, how much money you're able to raise. Polling is the third way of doing this. And you can create either a virtuous circle where your name recognition, you raise a lot of money so the press covers that, which means your polling numbers are likely to go up because people read these good stories about you, which means some of the candidates or some of the politicos out there who are looking for a good bandwagon to hop onto, they say, I kind of like this guy, I'm gonna get behind them. They endorse, that becomes another story, and this circle just goes on and on and on. You're seeing that right now. Elizabeth Warren is getting additional endorsements. She's raised a ton of money over the last quarter, and she's rising in the polls because she gets covered more. The candidates who don't get covered, don't make money, don't get endorsements, and they go in kind of a vicious circle now. Very hard to break through, and I think that's even more true today because we have the debates that are, your entry into debates is in part dependent upon your polling numbers. So we have this invisible primary, then we have the early contests, and we tend to think here in New Hampshire that we're all independent of everything, that our voters are smart, engaged voters, not really much more than anybody else. We have higher turnout, but we also have $250 million of advertising dumped on our heads and campaigning dumped on our heads in a 3-year period. But what happens in Iowa impacts what happens in New Hampshire. There'll be a lot of candidates that are on the ballot in Iowa that won't be on the ballot in New Hampshire, or they won't be credible in New Hampshire. After New Hampshire, it'll go down even further, so people in South Carolina and Nevada will have even a more limited pool of people to vote for, and they'll know who's the winner and who's a loser at that point. So polling is very difficult to look at, especially national polling, because what is going to happen in these states, especially states after these 4 early states, is completely dependent on what happens in this sequential process. So looking at national polls now is absolutely nonsensical, because most of the people who vote won't be able to see most of the candidates who are currently running when they go to the ballot box. Just not going to be there. So, and then typically by March we're done. So primaries are different, low turnout, generally low to moderate interest, even at the presidential level, and that sequential process I talked to. So it makes polling very, very difficult. When you look at election polls, as I mentioned, the hardest things that we have in election polls is not asking people who they're going to vote for, it's who's going to show up on election day. It's the hardest thing. Even here in New Hampshire, where we have high turnout in the primary, it might be 50% this year. How do you figure out which of those 50% of the people are gonna show up when there's this, we call a social desirability bias to say, yeah, I'm interested in the election, I'm gonna be there. But maybe overestimating your intent of voting. That's true for a lot of people. You have late changes in preference, and especially in primary polling, there's no real hook that people have. You think people are anchored to the candidates that are out there? If you're an activist, maybe. But the regular voters, what's the difference between Elizabeth Warren's healthcare plan or Bernie Sanders' healthcare plan or Joe Biden's healthcare plan? If you're a real wonk, you might know. The general public, they don't care. They're all pretty much Democratic plans. There's no difference between these candidates other than some personality issues or some funny thing they hear them say in a debate or some screw up they make in a debate. So there's not a lot of anchor to any of the voters. They move around all the time. And then finally is, what do you do with those people that are undecided? Because in any polling issue, we're gonna have 5 to 10% of the electorate who have not made up their mind on election day. In particular, that's true in primary polls. So, as I mentioned, there's no such thing as a national primary electorate. So if you look at these national polls, they're worthless. What they're doing is basically measuring name recognition. New Hampshire and Iowa are a little bit better. The polls here are better because there are actual campaigns going on. But I'd argue, even in New Hampshire at this point in time, polls are not predictive of what's going on at all in the election, who's going to win, who's going to be even on the ballot come time the things come around. So most candidates are not going to be on the polls. And it's really important to remember that the psychology of voters in a primary process. They're interested in electing somebody who can win in the general election. That's the whole point, right? You're picking a nominee for your party. How do you know if you've got a candidate that's going to win? Well, they win in the primary. Winners win and losers lose. So if you win in the early primaries, as we've seen, I'll use Jimmy Carter as a great example. He wins the Iowa caucuses in 1976. Actually, uncommitted won, but he came in second. He got media attention from that. He came to New Hampshire and he was able to campaign for 6 to 8 weeks back then. He was able to win the New Hampshire primary. He became a winner, and all those other guys that didn't understand the sequential process and the importance of momentum, they were saying, "Oh, I'll worry about the Massachusetts primary." By that time, it was over. They were losers. Rudy Giuliani in 2008 says, "I don't have to concentrate on those early states. I'm going to focus on Florida." By the time they got around to Florida, he had lost every of the early states. He was a loser. He had no chance. So you got to win. Winners win, losers lose. And voters make up their mind when they need to at the end of the campaign. So other things you need to pay attention to. You're interested in likely voters. New Hampshire, we have a real problem trying to figure out who's a likely voter. We can't go back with lists and say, well, these people voted in the last couple of primaries. Because we have same-day registration. And typically 10 to 15% of the people who show up on election day weren't registered. What do you do about that? You don't show up on any list. We have higher turnout in New Hampshire than most places, so we can't just go back and look at those activists who vote really routinely. In a state like Iowa, turnout's 10%, 15%. I think 15% is the maximum they've ever had in their Iowa caucuses. There you pretty much can figure out who's going to vote. In New Hampshire, you can't. The other problem we have in New Hampshire is we've got an unstable electorate, arguably the most unstable electorate in the country. Between 2000 and 2008 study that we did with Carsey folks, Ken Johnson and Dante Scala over at UNH, we figured out that a third of the potential voters between 2000 and 2008 were different people. They either moved into the state, about 21% had moved into the state, 22% had moved into the state in that period. The other ones weren't old enough to vote in 2000, but now they're old enough to vote in 2008. So, well, that's a one-off. Now we did it between 2008 and 2016. It was 30% of the electorate were different people. Now, not all of those are going to vote, but if you're a pollster and you're trying to figure out all of these people can vote, what do? You can't go back and use your old lists because you're going to systematically exclude a large chunk of the electorate. It makes it very difficult to poll the primary. So as I mentioned, state and national polls, national polls can't tell you who's gonna win the nomination. They're not gonna tell you who wins New Hampshire. They're already gonna tell you who's gonna be around. So this is 2008. I like 2008, maybe because I'm picking on Rudy Giuliani for saying you don't have to worry about New Hampshire. These were polls on averages in New Hampshire. Rudy's the purple line there. You can see by early 2008, he was already in second to third place. John McCain dipped down, then he came back up. Romney's leading here, and the other guys are down in the noise area. Did a big bubble for Fred Thompson, but then he campaigned and disappeared. But you can see that in New Hampshire, McCain's identified as going up pretty early there. Giuliani's an afterthought by October, November of 2008. If you look at the national polls though, who's the leader? Rudy. Significant lead over everybody else. Second place is McCain. He's down at 8%. Romney's at 8–10%. Mike Huckabee. Did he have a chance of being president? No, not really. But they were about 2 to 3 weeks behind anything that we saw here. So what was going on here was determining what people saw in the national polls. But guess what happens? If you see somebody going up in the polls in New Hampshire, John McCain surging in New Hampshire. There's going to be a national story about that. Then people nationally say, "Oh, John McCain, yeah, I forgot about him running. He's coming back. Oh, interesting." So when they get a phone call, they might say, "Oh yeah, John McCain. I heard that he's doing better now." And so there's a couple-week lag in the national polls compared to the early state polls. Part of the question is that voters ask is, why decide now? This is what I get from journalists a lot. Kevin knows better than this, but then outside journalists from other parts of the country, when I see these big numbers of people that are undecided, they say, well, how can people not have made up their mind yet? Why should they make up their mind? It's October now. The election's 4 months away. Why would you make up your mind? There's a lot of things to happen between now and then. 2 days before the election, why should I make up my mind? Who knows what will happen? So this is the exit polls going back to 2000. This is asking people, and this is New Hampshire. This is not national exit poll. This is New Hampshire primary exit polls. When did you decide who you were going to vote for? And look at the percentage of people who said they made up their mind on election day. It ranges from 15% up to 27% on the Republican side in 2016. How are you going to figure that out if you're a pollster? We typically are done interviewing on Sunday. It leaves Monday and Tuesday for people to make up their mind. If you look at the last 3 days, anywhere from 25% up to 40%. 47% in 2016 said they made up their mind in the last 3 days. We're asking people who they're going to vote for when the right answer is not sure. So it's very challenging. So I just want to use a couple examples of how this becomes problematic, not only for us as pollsters, but really in the narrative that's deciding what's going on in the campaign. So this is 2008 election. These are polls that we did at the Survey Center, and we're seeing that Hillary Clinton's kind of leading throughout. Barack Obama pops up here at the end. Edwards and Undecided. The people who really say, I have no idea who I'm going to vote for, 2 days before the election, they have to get it right. But they could have been, their methods could have been blind luck that they got it right at the end. But the way you calculated these are different, so it's not so good. Yes, sir.
In your, going back to when you were talking about the dollars involved, the ACT, I think St. Anselm does one, of course UNH. Are we doing it to make some money for the college and give some students some experience?
I wish I could say make money for the college, because we don't get any funding from the university, so all of our projects are paid for by other people.
That's my point.
Yeah, and so we partner with CNN. We give them, I would say, a bargain rate, so my professional time isn't included in those, because I look at that as our advertising. That's our marketing budget. But Quinnipiac, they do it a different model. They had a dean that came in from Marist College, and in Marist they had became well known because of polling that they did. He went down to Quinnipiac at that time, which was the Quinnipiac Business School or School of Business or College of Business or something, and said, we can boost our visibility by conducting polls. And they're close enough to New York City. They built an advisory committee of media people from various different television and newspaper medias, and they didn't do work for any one of them, but the university spent $1 million to $1.5 million on polling. It was the university's advertising budget. And since that time, it's gone from a school that nobody could pronounce to a school that now has Division I sports, and it's now Quinnipiac University. That's the way they built that university, is the advertising they got from their going into polling. It was a smart decision on the part of that dean. Universities, I do it because I teach courses and have done research on survey research. Polls are the one thing that you can, or election polling is the one time in which you have a real world event that you can try to predict. And try to figure out if the people that you talk to match the people who showed up. So academic survey researchers have relied on this for years because it's the one way we can test our methods. And if our methods don't work, we go back and look and figure out what's wrong with our methods and how we tweak those or change them. So there's a lot of reasons to do it, but the visibility is certainly one, because people in the press will run polls.
I was trying to link it to some of the student
The students, yes.
opportunity.
Yeah, for us, we typically average $350,000 that pays students every year. So it's a significant amount of money, and students can they can learn just doing the interviewing. Many of them are supervisors. We have a lot of our former students that go into the kind of the research back end of it and work in there. So yeah, it's a lot of training that they get out of that. So it's very valuable. Yes.
You emphasized that if we're going to pay any attention at all to polls, it ought to be to the polls in the early primary states. But I'm wondering if there isn't something else going on this year that involves a structural change. And it has to do with Super Tuesday and the fact that you've now got two huge states, one blue, California, one red, Texas, in addition to a whole bunch of other states that are following very close on in March. And I'm wondering whether that isn't going to be influenced to some extent by national polling. I'm just curious what your thoughts about that.
I would say no. Bill Mayer down at Northeastern has looked into the issue of what we call front loading, of getting more states up to the front. A lot of states do that, thinking that they're going to get more ability to influence who the nominee is. Well, the research shows the more front loading there is, the more important Iowa and New Hampshire become, because that winners win, losers lose makes a big difference. Because the time frame for you to run a campaign outside of New Hampshire, where there is structural campaigns and there's staff hired and all this sort of stuff, most campaigns don't have anybody in Texas or California. Because what happens here, think of the advertising dollars of what happens if you win the New Hampshire primary. How much of an ad buy that would be nationwide? Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of advertising that you get from that. That's why you gotta remember it's a sequential process. And a good number of the candidates that they may like in Texas or California right now, they won't even be on the ballot. So it's the winnowing process that Iowa and New Hampshire really serve. We don't pick the winners necessarily, but we determine who's going to be the front runner, who the main challenger is, and who's gone.
I would also point out that early voting for California starts on the day of the Iowa caucus, which is interesting to see how many people are going to vote for candidates who will not be
they're not going to be
when the
there.
actual California primary occurs on the first Tuesday in March. Their vote will have been wasted.
So I would say, this is an aside, but early voting and mail voting and all of these things that are designed to increase turnout, they don't work. The states that have gone to lots of early voting, or Oregon, where everybody votes by mail, their turnout's the same or down from when they did it before. Voting is not a hard act. Even in states which have barriers to voting, it's really pretty simple. You might have to wait in line 10 minutes longer than you did otherwise. The barrier to voting is here. It's not any other things. It's in your head. So I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference. Sure.
Andy, what can you say about the difference between the political election polls and then other kinds of public opinion polls? And you've given all of these challenges and obstacles in the political would you say that they exist on, some of these questions that you ask on the Granite State poll and whatnot?
Absolutely. We said the same barriers to getting hold of people.
Well, yeah, no, that one, but,
But the bigger issue that we have with any sort of public opinion polling is the assumption on the part of the researcher that the person that we're talking to knows or cares about the issue that we're asking them about. So I get a kick out of some of these polls. Remember back in 2008, when we're going through the financial crisis and they have this plan in Washington to rejigger the banks somehow and fund the banks. People are asking polls about whether do they approve or disapprove with the financial bailout plan to banks. The real answer, or how big of an impact is it going to do? Is it going to improve banks? Is it going to save banks? The real answer to that is, I have no idea. That's what the true answer for most people is, I may have heard of it, I have no idea what it's going to do, and I have no idea, because economists didn't have any idea whether it was going to work or not.
They still don't.
But they still have 60% favor, 35% opposing. If you ask people a question, they'll give you an answer. Because what we have is, when I started off saying that the issue we have in survey research is a psychological issue. There's the issue of social desirability. You don't want to look stupid in life. So when somebody asks you a question, because if you think of a survey as a kind of artificial conversation, I ask a question, you're expected to give an answer. And if you don't give an answer, if you say, well, I'm not sure, I haven't thought about it, and I'll say, well, do you lean more towards one side or the other? So I'm forcing you to give an answer. And the reality for most issue-based polling is, never heard of it, don't really care.
It might be, I don't care.
Yeah, and what we try to do in all of our questions is have outs saying, or have you thought that much about this, or is this not important to you, or do you not have an opinion on this? But polls that force people to choose, favor or oppose, it's nonsense. Especially, just think about if you see a polling on any sort of a policy issue, ask yourself, what do I know about that issue? And even if you're a policy expert, you say, yeah, I'm kind of familiar with some of the issues and what's going on here, but not a lot. And think about the person who's cooking dinner, and they got 2 kids running around, and you're asking about some arcane issue, and asking whether they favor or oppose this. Their answers, the true answer is probably, That's why presidential election polling or general election polling is typically much more accurate than primary polling, because we provide information. We say, are you going to vote for Donald Trump, the Republican, or Hillary Clinton, the Democrat? And people hear Democrat, Republican, and they vote for that. And especially if you get down past presidential, even past governor maybe, you get down to congressional seats, or I know there's elected officials here, I hate to say it, people vote for their state senators or their state house representatives, not because they know you. The myth in New Hampshire is we have 400 state reps, so everybody knows their state rep. The truth is nobody knows who their state rep is. They vote for R or D. And that I think is why those are more accurate. But policy polling is, there's a whole range of issues. Just give one good one, of methodological problems. We were doing some polling for the American Cancer Society. This is a long time ago, so the people who were in charge of this are gone. But they wanted to shift from their traditional role of funding research and education in cancer to pushing non-smoking campaigns. They had done a poll that asked that, do you think the American Cancer Society should continue its traditional mission of education and research on cancer, or should it get into public policy to stop smoking? Well, they had 60% said get into public policy about stopping smoking. I said, well, that looks like what we call a recency effect. People are more likely to choose the last thing that they heard. So we did this in 6 states where we rotated just the responses. Same question, same words, we just rotated the response. So you got traditional mission of education first and policy second, or policy first and education second. Whichever was read second got 60%. That's a 40 percentage point shift in whether you support or oppose something. It's an artifact. The real answer is people are saying, American Cancer Society, I think I've heard of them, I don't know what they do. So it is a real problem. I'm looking at the time here. I'd be happy to answer any other questions for you, but I think it's supposed to end at 9:30.
Yeah, we can do like one more.
One more. Yes, sir. You had a page.
When I look at your chart about the accuracy of the polls, and that's one of the stated goals, and then I look you know, my statistics training, and I always called it statistics, but that's neither here nor there. You know, that you no longer can pick a random sample and get the people to, so you end up trying to find that. But in addition to that, because you are putting out that poll, you are affecting the results by the answer you gave to the poll, just like you do in any measuring system. And it seems that you're never gonna get there because, you know, the reason you're doing it is to put out that information, but the more you put out that information, the more you affect the answer.
It's comforting to know that most people don't bother to read the news or watch the news, so we're not impacting them too much. But actually, a lot of research has gone into trying to look at the impact of polls on elections, and it's very minimal. There's the one bit that looked at this is a German professor named Elizabeth Noella Neumann that came up with a theory that she called the spiral of silence. And that she was looking at mainly campaigns in Germany in the 1980s and 1990s, where the theory basically comes down to is if you think that the candidate that you like is less popular, you are less likely to wear a button, less likely to put a bumper sticker on your car, less likely to talk about that candidate or support for that candidate at a cocktail party, and less likely to tell a pollster that you're going to vote for that candidate. But when it comes to election day, they still voted for that candidate. And you can make that argument, many people made the argument that's what happened in 2016. Donald Trump was certainly seen as the less appropriate candidate. You didn't see as many Donald Trump stickers and signs as you did Clinton signs, but they came out and voted anyway. So most of the research has shown that polls have had very little impact on elections. The one time where it did have an impact that you could count was in 1980. Exit polls were released before the voting polls were closed in California, and Jimmy Carter conceded the election before polls were closed in California, and many Democratic congressmen said that they lost in California because Democrats said, oh, hell with it, we've already lost the presidency, I'm not gonna bother to go vote now. But there's very little evidence that it actually swings people one way or the other. Good thing I had done. Thank you. Thank you very much.